Continuing on with chapter 13.3, peripheral nervous system. So we've talked about peripheral nervous system is what connects our central nervous system to our environment. We divide our peripheral nervous system into sensory and motor. Sensory we divide into somatic and visceral. Motor, very similar. Remember, but then also in the visceral section of in the autonomic section of the motor division, we also divided into sympathetic and parasympathetic. We talked about the spinal nerves, 31 pairs of spinal nerves, an anterior root that has the motor section, posterior root has the sensory section, also posterior ganglion is a collection of the cell bodies of the nerves, nerve cells that are traveling into that travel into nerve. The actual spinal nerve is basically a bundle of multiple axons from these nerve cell bodies. It's extending from these nerve cell bodies. The spinal nerves are all mixed nerves, sensory and motor. We talked about the cranial nerves, which have 3 sensory, 5 motor, and 4 that are mixed, right? And those the cranial nerves do not go through the spinal cord, so they go directly to the brain, primarily innervate above the shoulders. And now we're getting into the spinal nerves. So hopefully, it's all making sense, I hope. If not, if you need further explanation, you can email me or we can set up a meeting as we continue to move forward, okay? All right, so structure of the spinal nerves and spinal nerve plexuses. Remember, these nerves, cranial nerves and spinal nerves, are the main organs of the peripheral nervous system, right? The organ meaning multiple tissues working together for a specific function, right? You have connective tissue, the casing around these axons which are extending from the cell body. So you have multiple axons extending, and then you have casing around it. That's connective tissue. So that axons are actually nervous tissue and connective tissue. You also have blood vessels in these nerves to supply nutrients to these axons as they extend, they extend from the spinal cord. That's blood. That's going to supply nutrients. It's going to supply oxygen so that they can continue to live, obviously. And all of this is all very important, right? So we talked about the cranial nerves. Now let's talk about the spinal nerves, right? So spinal nerves are, here it says short, divides into 2 mixed nerves. Remember, you have sensory and motor. 2 mixed nerves, both carry somatic motor and sensory information, okay? You're going to see this term ramus, posterior ramus, travels to the posterior side of the body. Anterior ramus travels to the anterior side of the body and or to an upper or lower limb, okay? So talking about the spinal nerve, short, divides into 2 mixed nerves, which carry motor and sensory information, okay? So this is where it can start to get a little confusing as we get into some of this terminology, the structure of the spinal nerves, right? But just stick with me and we'll see if we can make sense of it, okay? So what are we looking at here? We're looking at a cross section of like the vertebrae, right? So vertebrae, remember that's your, we haven't talked about bone in detail yet, but that's part of your skeletal system. But remember, the vertebrae is sort of like the protective structure that surrounds the spinal cord. We talked about this structure when we were talking about the spinal cord. There's a little bit of connective tissue in there, some adipose in there, just protecting your spinal cord. Okay, so in here, and then you have your actual spinal cord is here, right? So then we have the spinal nerves, which is coming off. There's a split. It has a posterior section and an anterior section, posterior, anterior, which combine. So anterior is your motor, posterior is your sensory. Here's your ganglion, where you have your cell bodies. They combine to make what we call the spinal nerve, right? So when it forms that spinal nerve, which is a collection of axons, you have what they call the anterior ramus, fibers to and from anterior side of body and or upper and lower limbs, okay? And then you have posterior ramus, fibers to and from posterior side of body, right? So that spinal nerve comes to, so you have the anterior and posterior section that come together, form your spinal nerve, and then you have parts of it that go anterior ramus to the anterior side of the body, parts of it that go to the posterior side of the body, off of the spinal nerve, okay? All right, so know this whole structure. Your vertebrae, your spinal cord, your anterior, posterior. This is towards the front, towards the back. Spinal cord. This is the gray matter, the white matter. The gray matter is a little butterfly. Anterior root, posterior root, and then you have the spinal cord, and then you have off of that you have the anterior ramus and posterior ramus that splits off the spinal cord. Okay, now it's sort of, like I said, it can sort of get a little confusing. We've already said anterior, posterior roots. Now we have anterior, posterior roots, anterior, posterior ramus. So a lot of this can kind of get confusing, but just, let's kind of stick with it. Look at this picture. So here we have, it says anterior root carries somatic and visceral motor signals from the CNS to skeletal muscles and gland cells, right? This is your anterior root, right? Coming off the anterior portion, anterior gray matter of the spinal cord. The actual spinal nerve is when it all combines, your anterior and posterior combine. Posterior root carries this sensory signals, right? Sensory neuron. The ramus communicans, they're calling it here, carries visceral motor signals from the ANS to organs of the ventral body cavity, right? So autonomic nervous system is going through this visceral motor neuron, which is coming off of the spinal nerve, right? Anterior and posterior rami carry somatic motor signals from the CNS to the skeletal muscles, sensory signals and sensory receptors in the PNS to the spinal cord, right? So just showing you how different information gets to and from the spinal cord, how it all kind of splits off. Right? So you have 31 pairs of spinal nerves, right? 8 pairs of, so this is breaking down the structure in the back. Remember, everybody's probably heard of thoracic or lumbar. When you think of cervical, think of your neck, and then next thoracic, sort of like the chest area, then lumbar, sort of like the back, and then you get down into what we call the sacral and the coccygeal, okay, at the end, right? 8 plus 12 is 20 plus 5. 8 plus 12 is 20 plus 5 is 25. Plus 1 is 26. Wait a minute. I missed something here. Uh-oh. I made a mistake. Wait. So brain fart. It's late at night right now, and my brain is not functioning properly. So 8 cervical nerves, think of the neck. 12 pairs of thoracic, think of the chest. That thoracic region, think of like where your heart and lungs are. 5 pairs of lumbar, lower back, and then it's 5 pairs of lumbar and sacral nerves. So you have 5 in the lumbar and 5 in the sacral region. So 8 plus 12 is 20, plus 5 lumbar, 25, plus 5 sacral, 30, and then 1 coccygeal. Okay, so your professor was right. Just brain fart. All right, so that's how we divide the spinal nerves going down the spine. Okay, anterior rami, cervical. That's the most superior, and then lumbar and sacral spinal nerves each merge to form what we call nerve plexuses, which are complicated networks of nerves. Okay, so we have the anterior and posterior root. We have the ganglion, where we have the cell bodies, anterior posterior root coming off the anterior and posterior portions of the spinal cord. We have the ganglion, where we house the cell bodies at the swollen junction in the posterior root. That we have motor coming off anterior, sensory coming off posterior, combined to make a spinal nerve. Then we have the rami, anterior rami, and posterior rami, going to different parts of the body. And specifically with the anterior, towards the front rami, we have what we call nerve plexuses, complicated networks of nerves. Remember the anterior rami, right? Anteriorly, that's where you have your visceral, a lot of your visceral motor functions, right? So going to your organs, okay? Visceral motor signals from the autonomic nervous system, okay? So that's very important. So then out of these anterior rami, we're going to see the nerve plexuses, complicated networks of nerves, right? So just remember all those terms. I know it's a lot of terms: rami, ganglia, roots, neurons, dendrites, axons, endoneurium, the different connective tissues that are involved, gray matter, white matter. So a lot of all these different terms are involved when we're talking about the spinal nerves and the peripheral nervous system in general, right? So your cervical nerves, thoracic nerves, lumbar, sacral nerves, and coccygeal nerves, right? So 8, 12, 5, 5, and 1, okay? And then we have the plexuses off of the cervical, lumbar, and sacral, right? You'll see also the brachial plexus, which brachial should ring a bell. You should think of the arm, brachial plexus, but that's part of the cervical nerves. All right, so let's go into it. All right, so the anterior rami, so the anterior section of nerve that's coming off of the spinal nerve going towards the anterior front of the body, anterior rami. All right, so we're talking about, so right and left cervical plexus, cervical, most superior portion of your spinal cord. All right, deep to the neck, lateral first through fourth cervical vertebrae, the anterior rami of this C1 through C5. So C just means cervical, and small contribution from the hypoglossal nerve. Remember the hypoglossal, the cranial nerve, the one cranial nerve that we know affects areas sort of below Well, no, not that. I'm thinking of the vagus nerve. Sorry. Also a small contribution from the hypoglossal nerve. All right, so the cervical plexus, each nerve has cutaneous, remember cutaneous skin, cutaneous branches, innervates the skin of the neck and sections of the head, chest, and shoulders, chest, right? So so cervical, so a plexus is a complicated network of nerves. This complicated network of nerves that comes from the cervical spine innervates the skin of the head, neck, chest, and shoulders, right? So, and then it has motor branches that innervate specific muscles in the neck, right? It makes sense. Your cervical spine controls motion in your neck. And then we also have the phrenic nerve, major motor branch of C4, with contributions from 3 and 5, which innervates the diaphragm. What do we need our diaphragm for? To breathe, right? So that's controlled by your cervical plexus, right? And that's just showing you that diagram there. And I don't expect you to know every single nerve. You don't have to know where every nerve goes in your body, but you know, you do need to kind of generally know these ideas. Which areas are generally controlled by which nerves, right? Brachial plexus, which is primarily part of the cervical, your cervical nerves, right and left brachial plexus, right? So, you know, right and left, remember all your 31 spinal nerves are paired. So you have the right and left. So you have right and left brachial plexuses, lateral to the 5th cervical through 1st thoracic, right? So you do use the C1 through T1. All right, provide motor and sensory innervation of upper limbs, my arms, right? That's primarily controlled by my brachial plexus, which is part from my cervical spine and from my T1, my thoracic spine. Right? Brachial plexus begin with the formation of large nerve trunks. And it just talks about the details of the brachial plexus. Right? It controls my upper limbs, right? And it goes into some details about that. I don't really need you to know all of the different divisions of the brachial plexus. Just know that the idea that, you know, these nerves come together and they basically control your upper limbs, okay? And this is where we get our, the sort of like the nerves in our arms. So sensations in your arms are coming to your brachial plexus, you know, complex nerve pathway of nerves connected to your cervical spine down to your T1 thoracic spine, okay? Some major nerves in your brachial plexus, your axillary nerve, deltoid and teres minor muscles and skin over your deltoid region, your radial nerve, your triceps, musculocutaneous nerve, innervates anterior arm muscles, including the biceps, okay? So those are some of your major nerves that form from your brachial plexus. Just showing you that structure there. Then we go down to your thoracic spinal nerves. Okay, so that's going to be cervical, brachial, which is primarily cervical, but also T1 thoracic. And then we go down to our thoracic, and remember the nerve plexuses are just from the cervical, lumbar, and sacral. So we don't have nerve plexuses with our thoracic nerves. But what we do have, except for our T1, but what we do have is each posterior ramus. Posterior, what's that? Sensory or motor. Posterior is generally sensory. Each posterior ramus innervates deep back muscles, and each anterior ramus travels between 2 ribs as an intercostal nerve. All right, so left and right lumbar plexuses The lumbar plexuses are next. So that's the next area where we have plexuses. So just remember your thoracic spinal nerves, back muscles, and your ribs. Okay. Now we have the left and right lumbar plexuses. Right, branches innervate pelvic structures and lower extremities. Right. Lower extremities, what are those? Your legs, right? After splitting into two divisions. So this is derived from L1 through L5, anterior to vertebrae, embedded deep within the psoas muscle. If you do any type of yoga or, work with a personal trainer, hopefully they know the psoas muscle. It's it's a muscle that people can hold tension in. It can definitely be tight. And when it's tight, it can cause, different types of pain. So people will constantly work it out to, due to this, the nervous tissue being embedded in it. Okay, and so you'll see here the lateral femoral cutaneous nerve, femoral nerve, genitofemoral nerve. Okay? So innervating pelvic structure around the hips, basically, and then your lower body. And it talks about some of the nerves off of the lumbar plexus. Femoral nerve travels from the psoas to the pelvis, blah, blah, blah. Anterior thigh muscles, innervates anterior thigh muscles and skin over anterior medial thigh and leg. Right? So that's going to basically help you walk, that femoral nerve. Right? So it's showing you some of those structures there. Being able to extend your knee, for instance. So, when we were sitting on the edge of the table doing the reflexes, okay? So something like that, that muscle that's causing your quadricep to, kick the leg, that's your femoral nerve. Okay? So that comes from your lumbar spine, specifically your lumbar plexus. And then you have sacral plexuses. This is your last area where we have plexuses. Formed from anterior rami, so anterior towards the front of spinal nerves, L4 through S4. All right, innervates structures in the pelvis, gluteal region, your buttocks, and much of your lower extremities. This is where we have the sciatic nerve. Remember that one? Very important nerve. It's coming off your sacral plexus. Sciatic is your longest and largest nerve in the body. You should definitely remember that one, just because it's very significant. Goes, basically from your lower back down through your leg. Contains axons for both anterior and posterior divisions of the sacral plexus. Travels through the greater sciatic notch in the pelvis, right? So from like your hips, and innervates hip joint, posterior thigh before it divides into tibial and common fibular nerves all the way down your leg. All right, you also have tibial nerve, fibular nerve, right, which are branches of the sciatic nerve. So that's why you have issues with your sciatic. People say sciatica. You can have an issue in your back and you can feel it all the way down the bottom of your leg. Right? And that's the sciatic nerve, which branches off into your tibial and your fibular nerve, right? So an issue up here, the top with your sciatic could cause an issue way down here. Right? So that's something, remember, it's all connected, right? Cell bodies up here, the axons extend all the way down. And that's just a summary of the distribution of spinal nerve branches, nerve plexuses. And this is just showing you the motor distribution, which nerves, cutaneous distribution was this page, and then motor distribution, showing which groups of muscles these nerves carry motor signals to. Right? And that's the end of section 13.3.